Unlike the anterior compartment of the forearm muscles, the posterior compartment of the forearm muscles really are all found more or less in one layer. Now, these muscles are going to start with the same key identifier as we did with the anterior compartment, which is the brachioradialis. So this landmark muscle will identify if we are going to be on the anterior or the flexor side of the forearm or the posterior or extensor side of the forearm. Now, once you've properly identified the brachioradialis, we're going to follow a similar naming protocol that we did with the anterior compartment muscles, meaning that these muscles are going to be named first with an action descriptor, and then they'll tell us what target structure, and lastly have a descriptive term. So we're going to see that as we begin with the brachioradialis as our landmark muscle, we can then start to progress down the lateral side or the radial side of the forearm with an accurate description of these muscles. The first name tells us the action, so these will be the extensor muscles of the wrist on the radial side with either a long or a short tendon. So the extensor carpi radialis longus muscle has a long name. However, it's a very descriptive name that will tell you exactly where it goes and what it does. So this is an extensor of the wrist on the radial side with a long tendon. Located immediately deep to this muscle, we see the extensor carpi radialis brevis muscle. Now, the extensor carpi radialis brevis muscle is going to be located deeply to the extensor carpi radialis longus muscle. The length of the tendon is going to differ. So the longus will have a longer tendon and the brevis will have a shorter tendon. The abductor pollicis longus is sort of an exception in this region. However, it's going to have a similar naming protocol. It abducts or abducts the thumb, its target, the pollicis, with a long tendon. And the reason I call it an oddball is it's one of the few that does not have extensor in the name in this posterior compartment. So the abductor pollicis longus muscle is going to cross superficial to the tendons of extensor carpi radialis brevis and longus. As we continue moving down the forearm, we're going to encounter two muscles that extend the thumb, one with a short tendon and one with a long tendon. So here we see that we have the extensor pollicis brevis next to the extensor pollicis longus. Now, interestingly enough, once you have identified the brachioradialis muscle, these muscle names are all going to alternate with their last term being longus, then brevis, back to longus, to brevis, back to longus. So every other term switches. So we have extensor carpi radialis longus, then extensor carpi radialis brevis. The abductor pollicis longus is going to be in between the two extensors of the wrist and our two extensors of the thumb, the extensor pollicis brevis and extensor pollicis longus. Now we see that all of these tendons are going to pass deep to the extensor retinaculum, and all of those 5 muscles are on the radial or thumb side of our forearm. In the middle of the posterior forearm, we see the extensor digitorum. Now note that there is no longus or brevis or superficialis and profundus with this muscle. It is simply known as the extensor digitorum. So extensor of the digits. Now on the most medial side or ulnar side, we see the extensor carpi ulnaris. And as its name would imply, this is going to be the extensor of the wrist on the ulnar side. And compare that, there's only one extensor carpi ulnaris, while we had 2 extensor carpi radialis longus and extensor carpi radialis brevis on the radial side. The last 2 muscles only go to one target finger, the extensor digiti minimi and the extensor indicis. So there's a tendon located deep here to the extensor digitorum that goes to only the index finger, and an extensor of the little finger that only goes to the pinky, and that will be on the medial or ulnar side of the extensor digitorum.